Lonely Mountain Man. Found a young boy hanging on the roof with Apache lover, burned. 1878, Wyoming. The sun barely peeks over the jagged ridgelines of the high mountains when Robert Boone, a man long haunted by the scars of the Civil War, steps outside into the crisp morning air. But the sight before him isn't the peaceful solitude he's grown accustomed to. There, hanging from his roof, is a young boy, lifeless, his body swinging like a grim warning, and beneath him a cruel mark has been burned into the door. Apache lover. No, it's not a message he can ignore. This is personal. But what would drive someone to do such a thing, and why leave a boy behind? As Robert struggles to piece together the mystery, a darker truth emerges, one that may force him to confront his own past, make impossible decisions, and fight battles he thought he'd left behind. Who is hunting this boy? And what does this haunting message mean for Robert's future? If you're hooked by this twisted tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with anyone who loves Wild West stories filled with suspense and survival. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Let's dive into the mystery of Robert Boone and the chilling discovery that changes everything. The morning sky was still pale, the mountains shrouded in a quiet mist. Robert Boone stepped outside his cabin, boots crunching softly in the frost. The cold air bit at his skin, the crisp scent of pine trees filling his lungs. He had lived here in seclusion for years, his past buried deep beneath layers of silence. The world he once knew, the war, the battles, the death, was a faraway nightmare he tried to forget. This cabin, these mountains, were all he had left. He'd lost everything in the war. His wife, his child, both taken by the violence that had followed him home. The pain of their loss had driven him into these wild hills, where no one could reach him and nothing could hurt him. But the peace he'd found here was fragile, built on the ashes of his former life. As he stood in the doorway, staring out into the vast emptiness of the forest, something tugged at the edge of his mind, a feeling he couldn't shake. A sharp scent, unfamiliar and unsettling, cut through the usual smells of pine and damp earth. It was the acrid stench of something burned, something wrong. Robert frowned, scanning the surroundings, but saw nothing. Just trees, rocks, and the eerie stillness of the wilderness. Then he saw it, a dark shape against the roofline of the cabin. It was too still, too unnatural. His heart skipped a beat. A figure, hanging from the ridge beam of the roof, feet barely touching the ground. The body of a child, limp and lifeless, swung gently in the breeze. His stomach tightened as he took in the sight. The boy's face was pale, eyes closed, his small form swaying. Robert's mind raced, trying to understand what he was seeing. Who would do such a thing? And why leave a child so brutally exposed? But it wasn't just the child that struck him. It was the mark burned into the door below the body. The words Apache lover were seared into the wood, bold and crude. Whoever had left this message had done so with hate and intent, marking the boy as something more than a victim. Robert's hand instinctively reached for his rifle, but he hesitated. He hadn't held a weapon in years. Not for revenge, not for violence. The weight of it felt foreign, almost unnecessary. He wasn't afraid of fighting, but of what this discovery meant. The moment he turned away from the cabin, he heard it. Gunshots in the distance, sharp, quick, and close. A chill ran down his spine as he realized someone was coming for the boy. Someone knew he wasn't dead. Someone had seen what Robert had just found. Robert didn't hesitate. He ran, his boots pounding the earth, the boy's weight a heavy but steady reminder of the urgency. The forest seemed to close in on him, the branches scratching at his coat, the rocks slippery beneath his feet. He kept moving, driven by a primal need to protect. The clearing where he had set up his shelter came into view, and Robert pushed himself harder. The boy's shallow breaths were all he could focus on now, and the steady crack of gunfire still echoed in the distance, like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. He reached the small cabin by the stream, barely pausing to catch his breath. The door creaked as he stepped inside, careful not to make any noise. He laid the boy down on a bed of furs and blankets, hoping the warmth of the fire would help restore him. Robert checked the boy's pulse again. Still faint, still steady, but weak. He had to act quickly. The boy had suffered, and Robert had no idea who was after him or why. But he couldn't let the boy die. Not like this. Not when there was a chance to save him. Outside, the sound of gunfire had stopped, replaced by the eerie quiet of the forest. Robert listened, heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure who was hunting them, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The boy's presence here was no accident. He moved away from the boy for a moment, his thoughts racing. What was happening? Who would leave a child to die like that with such a vile message? And why in God's name had the boy survived? What did they want with him? With Robert? The forest outside was still, but the silence felt wrong. It was the kind of silence that came before a storm, before something dangerous was about to happen. Robert knelt next to the boy again, checking his breathing, feeling the pulse beneath his skin. The boy stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering. A soft, painful groan escaped his lips. Robert held his breath, waiting for him to wake fully. This was their only chance to find out what had happened. And he needed to know. Who would do this to a child? And why? Robert's mind returned to his past, to the war, to the days he'd tried so hard to forget. He had fought alongside men who would do anything for a cause, no matter how vile. But this was different. This was personal. The boy's survival was tied to something far darker than Robert had anticipated. The boy's eyes opened fully, though they were clouded with confusion and fear. He blinked up at Robert, taking in the rough cabin, the warmth of the fire, the strange man kneeling beside him. Robert spoke softly, trying to ease the fear that had overtaken him. "You're safe," he said, though he wasn't sure if the boy would believe him. The boy's lips parted, but no sound came out. His body trembled as he shifted, his hand clutching at the blankets beneath him. Robert could see the fear in his eyes, the terror of someone who had seen too much, too young. It was a look Robert knew all too well. The moment stretched on, the weight of the situation settling on both of them. Robert had saved the boy, but he wasn't sure what would come next. The mystery was only beginning and the danger was far from over. Someone was coming, and they wouldn't stop until they had the boy. The acrid smell of burning wood clung to the air. Robert Boone stood frozen for a moment, scanning the horizon. His instincts screamed at him, urging him to find the source. But where? The smell had a sharpness that seemed almost deliberate, as if calling him. As his eyes scanned the cabin, something caught his attention. A small patch of scorched wood, far too fresh, lay near the door. Robert's pulse quickened. That wasn't just firewood. It was something far more disturbing. Someone had deliberately burned this place and left a message. Stepping closer, Robert's breath hitched. The words, "Apache lover," had been burned into the wood beneath the overhang. The charred letters were uneven, crude, yet unmistakable. The smell of sulfur still lingered, thick and suffocating. It was meant to shock, to leave a mark, one that couldn't be erased. His mind raced. The boy. The body hanging from the roof. What was the connection? Robert's eyes flickered toward the cabin door where the burnt mark taunted him. His hand hovered over the wood, fingers trembling as if the fire's heat still lingered beneath the surface. The mark was no accident. Someone had gone out of their way to send a message, and it was clear. Robert had been meant to see it, to understand it, to feel the weight of its meaning. But who? And why bring a child into this? The term Apache lover stung with familiarity. It wasn't just an insult, it was a symbol, a deep-rooted hatred that could only come from someone who'd lived through the atrocities of the borderlands. Robert knew this. He had seen the same anger when he was a soldier. But this boy? Why the child? Was he being used as a pawn in a larger game, or had he, like Robert, become a casualty of a world still steeped in violence? Robert's thoughts turned darker as he moved away from the door. He had to focus on the immediate, the boy's survival. The boy still lay inside the cabin, barely breathing, his body fragile like a bird's. Robert stepped back into the shelter, glancing over his shoulder as he closed the door. The silence of the forest was maddening. No birds, no wind, just the hollow sound of his own thoughts. Robert knelt beside the boy, inspecting the signs of trauma. His breath was shallow, his skin cold. The boy's wounds were not life-threatening, but the circumstances were. No one would leave a child like this without good reason. Robert's gut twisted as he realized how much he didn't know. It was a bitter reality. The boy had survived the hanging, but for what purpose? Was he simply left to die? Or had someone meant for him to be found? Robert's mind struggled with the possibilities. None of them good. Whatever had brought him here, it was far from over. He thought about the boy's terrified eyes, the way he'd hung limply from the roof. There was a story there, one that would be told in time. But first, Robert needed to make sure the boy survived long enough to tell it. He wasn't sure what came next. The days ahead would not be easy. Robert wasn't sure how much longer the boy could hold on. The fever had already begun to set in, his small body burning with heat. Robert did what he could, using cool water from the stream to soothe the boy's fevered skin. Night fell quickly in the mountains. The chill of the evening seeped into the cabin, but Robert didn't dare stoke the fire too high. Not yet. Not when the danger still lingered in the trees outside. He stayed close to the boy, watching his shallow breaths, praying for them both. As the hours passed, the boy's condition worsened. Robert worked steadily, using rags to wipe the sweat from his face, his hands gentle as he tried to keep the boy comfortable. The night felt endless, each minute stretching into the next. But it was all he could do for now. He hadn't expected to be here taking care of someone else. He hadn't expected to be responsible for another life, especially one so young. His mind wandered back to his own family, to the loss that had shaped him. But this boy wasn't his family. He was a stranger. Yet still, Robert couldn't turn away. The fever broke sometime during the night. Robert's relief was short-lived, as the boy's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused and distant. He wasn't speaking yet, but Robert could see the flicker of awareness in his eyes. He was alive. That was all that mattered for now. But the boy's silence spoke volumes. He wasn't just recovering from his wounds, he was trying to piece together his own world, a world that had been shattered and violently remade in a matter of days. Robert couldn't begin to understand what that was like, but he could try to help. The boy's hand twitched weakly, and Robert gently held it, offering comfort. "You're safe now," Robert murmured, unsure if the boy could hear him. It was a lie. They were far from safe, but it was the only thing he could say, and the boy needed to hear it. The sun was barely a sliver of gold on the horizon when Robert stepped outside. His boots crunched against the frozen earth as he took in the towering pines surrounding his cabin. The mountain air was sharp, but the silence felt heavier than usual today. The boy was still inside, feverish and weak. Robert had been awake for hours, unable to rest. His mind was consumed with questions. Who had left the child hanging? Why had they marked him? And what role did Robert play in this strange, violent puzzle? The memories of war, of his wife and child, flooded his mind uninvited. His family had been torn apart years ago, caught in the chaos of a border raid. He'd lost them both in a moment of madness, a moment he could never forget. He shook his head, forcing the painful memories back. This boy wasn't his family. He was someone else's burden now. Yet Robert couldn't shake the feeling that they were both linked in some way. His life had been marked by violence. Now this boy's life was as well. As the hours dragged on, Robert's thoughts drifted to his past. The war had been brutal, and after it ended, he'd retreated to the mountains, hoping to bury the memories. But memories didn't die. They just followed you, lingering like shadows in the corners of your mind. He ran a hand over his face, trying to shake off the weight of it all. But the silence of the forest felt unsettling, as if it was waiting for something to happen. The world around him was still, yet something in the air felt like a storm was brewing. The boy stirred inside the cabin. Robert stood and walked to the door, pausing before entering. The boy's breathing had become more regular, but he was still deeply unconscious, lost in the fever's grip. Robert had no medicine, no way of knowing if the boy would make it. He crouched beside the boy, his eyes softening as he looked down at the fragile figure. The boy's chest rose and fell slowly, his skin pale but no longer burning with fever. But Robert knew the danger wasn't over. This wasn't just a sickness, it was a battle for survival. The boy's hand twitched, and Robert reached out instinctively. "You're not alone," he murmured. The words felt hollow, a reassurance that didn't feel real, but they were all he had to offer. He was the only one who could help, whether he wanted to or not. Outside, the trees rustled, and Robert's gaze shifted to the woods. Something was out there, something just beyond his reach. It wasn't the usual animals that roamed the forest. No, this was different. The air was thick with tension, as if something or someone was watching. He stood up quickly, moving toward the window and peering through the crack. Nothing. The forest was still, the pines unmoving in the cold morning air. But Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It was as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. His instincts screamed at him to prepare. The boy was still unconscious, vulnerable. Robert grabbed his rifle and checked the door, making sure it was securely locked. He hadn't heard anything, but that didn't mean he was safe. Danger had a way of creeping in unnoticed. As the hours passed, the sun began to climb higher in the sky, the cold easing into a reluctant warmth. The silence in the cabin grew more pronounced. Robert sat by the fire, waiting, his thoughts drifting back to the past, to the war, to the things he could never undo. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him again. It was the reason he had fled to the mountains, the reason he kept to himself. He had tried to outrun his past, but it was always there, always lingering, reminding him of the choices he'd made. But this was different. The boy's presence in the cabin had unearthed something in Robert, a need to protect, to do something right for once. He couldn't explain it, but he couldn't turn his back on the boy. Not after everything he'd seen, not after the horror he'd already witnessed. The boy's eyes fluttered open, and Robert immediately moved to his side. "You're awake," Robert said quietly, his voice hoarse. The boy's gaze was distant, confused. He wasn't sure where he was or how he'd gotten there. But Robert knew what the boy needed: safety and time to heal. Robert's mind raced as the boy's eyes locked onto his. There was fear in them, fear of something he couldn't understand. And in those eyes, Robert saw something that made his blood run cold. The boy had seen something terrible, something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The boy shifted weakly, his hands trembling as he tried to sit up. Robert placed a firm hand on his shoulder, gently pushing him back onto the furs. "Rest," Robert said, his voice low and steady. "You're not well yet. You need to recover." But the boy wasn't listening. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something. Someone. "Where am I?" the boy asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" Robert paused. "I'm Robert Boone," he said. "You're safe here, for now." The boy didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told Robert all he needed to know. The boy wasn't just running from something, he was running from someone. And that someone would come for him. The cabin was silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Robert sat across from the boy, who had fallen into a restless sleep. His breathing was still shallow, but at least it was steady. It was a small comfort. Robert had seen death many times in his life. Men falling in battle, women and children caught in the crossfire of a war they never asked for. But this boy, he was different. There was something about him that made Robert feel responsible, even though he didn't want to be. The boy's name was still unknown to him. He had yet to speak about his past, about how he came to be hanging from Robert's roof. But Robert knew better than to rush it. The boy had been through something horrific. The light from the fire flickered in the small cabin, casting shadows on the rough walls. The boy's face was pale, his eyes sunken and filled with fear. He had seen too much for someone so young. Robert could see that in every twitch of his body. Suddenly, the boy's eyes snapped open. He gasped for air, his body jerking with fear. Robert quickly moved to his side, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "It's all right," he said, his voice soothing. "You're safe. You're not there anymore." The boy's eyes darted around the room, confusion and terror flashing in his gaze. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Who are you?" The words were weak, strained, but they cut through Robert like a knife. The boy had been through something that left him shattered. "I'm Robert Boone," he replied softly. "You're safe here for now. I found you. You're not alone anymore." But even as he spoke, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that the boy was only a small part of a much bigger story, one that was just beginning to unfold. The boy didn't respond immediately. His eyes were glazed, distant, as if he were trying to remember something, or perhaps trying to forget. Robert could only guess. He knew too well what it was like to try to forget. But it wasn't that simple. "I didn't ask for this," the boy muttered, his voice barely audible. His words were filled with exhaustion, with defeat. Robert could hear the pain in them, the kind of pain that only comes from losing everything, from being torn apart by forces beyond your control. Robert took a deep breath, his gaze softening as he looked at the boy. "I know," he said. "None of us ask for it, but that doesn't mean we don't survive. And you're still here. You're still fighting." The boy's gaze met his, a flicker of understanding passing between them. But the boy's fear didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. He sat up abruptly, his hands clutching the blankets. "They'll come for me," he said, his voice filled with dread. "I can't stay here. I can't let you get hurt because of me." Robert could see the desperation in his eyes. Robert's heart clenched. He understood the boy's fear, understood it all too well. But Robert wouldn't let the boy run, not again, not this time. "They won't find you here," Robert said, his voice firm but kind. "And I'll make sure they don't. You're safe." The boy shook his head violently, his fists clenched in the blankets. "I'm not safe anywhere," he whispered, almost to himself. "They'll never stop looking for me. They'll kill anyone who helps me." His words were like ice, freezing Robert's heart in an instant. The boy's terror was raw, palpable. "Who are they?" Robert asked, though he already had an idea. The message burned into the door, the Apache lover mark. It all pointed to something deep, something ugly, something that wouldn't go away. Robert had lived through violence before, but this felt different. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he fell back against the furs, his eyes closing once again. Robert could see the exhaustion in him, mental, physical, emotional. The boy had fought, and he had survived. But the fight wasn't over. Robert knew that much. The night passed slowly. Robert sat by the fire, the crackling flames providing little comfort. His thoughts were consumed with the boy and the situation they were now in. It was clear that whoever had done this to the boy was still out there, still hunting him, and Robert would have to face them. As the first light of dawn crept into the cabin, Robert stood and stretched. He moved quietly, not wanting to disturb the boy's fragile rest. He checked the door, making sure it was secure. The silence of the forest outside was deafening, but he knew better than to let his guard down. The boy stirred again, his breathing shallow but steady. Robert knew it was time to get some answers. The boy had been through hell, and it was clear that whatever had happened to him was linked to something bigger, something darker. Robert had to know who was behind it. He crouched beside the boy once again, his voice low and steady. "I need you to tell me what happened," Robert said. "Who are they? Why are they hunting you?" The boy's eyes flickered open, and for a moment Robert saw something new in them. Resignation. The boy swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he spoke. "They came for me last winter," he said, his words barely above a whisper. "I ran with them, the ones who understood me, the ones who didn't care about the blood that runs through my veins. I loved him." Robert's heart stopped. He didn't know what the boy meant, but the pain in his eyes told him everything. This was more than just survival. This was love, loss, and betrayal, and it was just the beginning of a much darker journey for both of them. Robert sat still in the corner of the cabin, his eyes fixed on the boy, who was still struggling to process everything. The words he had spoken earlier hung in the air, heavy with implications. Love, blood, betrayal. It was all tangled together now. The boy had fallen silent after his confession, his eyes distant, as if the memories were too much for him to bear. Robert couldn't blame him. He had seen too much pain in his life, and there was a part of him that wanted to turn away. But he couldn't. Not now. Not with the boy so close to breaking. Robert had promised himself he would never again turn his back on someone in need, no matter how dark the past was. This was his chance to do something right. The boy shifted on the furs, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the window. Robert followed his gaze, his own instincts telling him something was wrong. The quiet of the forest felt too still, too waiting. He had the uneasy sense that they were being watched. "I can't stay here," the boy whispered suddenly, his voice hoarse. Robert turned toward him, meeting his fearful gaze. "They'll come for me," the boy continued. "They'll come for both of us." His words were sharp, like the crack of a branch in the night air. Robert stood quickly, his hand resting on the rifle by the door. The boy was right. It wasn't safe. He had no idea who was hunting them, but it didn't matter. All that mattered now was getting the boy to safety. There was no more room for hesitation. "Who are they?" Robert asked, his voice calm but firm. The boy shook his head, his hands trembling. "I don't know," he whispered. They came for me, and they'll come again. They always come." The words were empty, hollow, uttered by someone who had learned to fear everything. Robert's mind was racing. The boy's terror was real, and it was clear that whoever was after him was relentless. But Robert knew one thing. He couldn't run, not anymore. He had tried that once, and it hadn't worked. Now there was no choice but to stand. The silence stretched between them. Robert moved toward the window, peering through the crack in the shutters. Nothing. Just the wind moving through the trees, the rustling leaves. But that stillness, it was too perfect, too calm. He felt a shiver crawl down his spine. Something was wrong. "Stay here," Robert said as he grabbed his coat. Don't make a sound. I'll be back in a minute." The boy didn't argue, though his eyes betrayed a mixture of fear and desperation. Robert didn't have time to explain. The boy didn't need to understand everything just yet. He only needed to survive. The cold air hit Robert like a slap as he stepped outside. The wind howled through the pines, sending the trees swaying in ominous rhythms. Robert scanned the surroundings, every muscle in his body tensed. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but his instincts told him he wasn't alone. A twig snapped in the distance. Robert's hand flew to his rifle, his heart racing. He moved silently through the trees, his steps careful, measured. The boy's words echoed in his mind. They always come. The fear in the boy's voice had been too real to ignore. They were being hunted. Robert's eyes darted between the shadows of the trees, trying to pick out any movement. There was nothing. Just the endless stretch of wilderness that had once offered him peace, but now felt like a trap. He wasn't alone, though. He could feel it. They were out there. He stopped and crouched low behind a thick bush, listening. Footsteps, a faint crunching of leaves. Someone was close. Robert gripped his rifle tighter, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that he was being watched. The forest had never felt more like a cage. He glanced back toward the cabin. No sign of the boy. Robert knew he couldn't risk leaving him unguarded, but he also couldn't risk walking blindly into danger. Whoever was out there knew what they were doing. They were waiting for the right moment. He had to be ready. The wind shifted, and for the first time, Robert caught a scent. Something faint, something metallic. Blood? He couldn't tell. But his instincts screamed that they were being surrounded. He had to move fast, or they'd have no chance. The forest wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a hunting ground. He stood and moved quickly toward the cabin, but before he could take more than a few steps, a sharp crack echoed from behind him. Robert spun around, rifle raised, just in time to see a figure darting through the trees. A silhouette, fleeting but unmistakable. Someone was tracking them. Someone with intent. Robert's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted back to the cabin. The boy had to be safe. He had to be. No matter what, Robert wasn't going to lose him. Not after everything. Not after the world had already taken so much. He burst through the door, nearly knocking it off its hinges. The boy was sitting up, eyes wide with fear. He didn't speak, but his gaze told Robert everything. He knew something was wrong. And Robert knew, too. It was time to leave, time to run, to get out before they were caught. Robert grabbed the boy's arm, pulling him to his feet. "We're leaving," he said firmly. "Now." The boy hesitated, then nodded. No more words were needed. They were in this together now, and the hunt had begun. There was no turning back. The cabin door slammed shut behind them as Robert and the boy sprinted into the woods, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The wind howled through the trees, but Robert couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else following them. The forest felt alive, but not in a comforting way. It seemed to close in around them, thick with shadows. Robert's breath was ragged, his heart pounding as he led the boy through the underbrush, knowing that every step they took could be their last. The boy's feet were stumbling, exhaustion weighing him down. Robert could hear him gasping for air, his steps faltering. "Keep up," Robert urged, though his own body was beginning to feel the strain. They couldn't afford to slow down. Not now. The wind shifted again, carrying a distant sound. The unmistakable crack of a branch snapping underfoot. Robert's eyes darted toward the source of the sound, his heart skipping a beat. They weren't alone. Someone was behind them. The hunt had begun in earnest. The boy looked up, fear in his eyes. "They're coming," he whispered, almost as if he could hear them too. Robert nodded, urging him forward. "Keep moving," he said, though his own doubts were creeping in. They couldn't outrun them forever. The trees seemed to twist in the wind, their branches reaching out like claws. Robert tried to steady his breathing, but it was impossible to ignore the tension tightening in the air. Something was coming, and they wouldn't escape it by running alone. He had to find a way to fight back. But how? He hadn't drawn his rifle in years. The old weapon felt heavy, foreign in his hands now. His heart was torn between the need to protect and the guilt of knowing he had long abandoned that part of himself. The boy faltered again, his legs giving way beneath him. Robert caught him just in time, his strength fading. "Stay with me," Robert said through gritted teeth, pulling the boy back to his feet. They had no time to waste. The others were closing in. They had to keep moving. They reached a small clearing, the trees parting slightly to reveal a narrow path leading deeper into the forest. Robert hesitated for a moment before making the decision. "This way," he said, pulling the boy down the path. It was a gamble, but it was all they had. The path grew narrower as they moved, the dense underbrush pressing in on all sides. Every step felt like a trap, every sound amplified by the silence of the forest. Robert's mind raced. He needed to outthink them, to stay one step ahead. But time was running out. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Footsteps. A distant shout. Robert's heart thudded in his chest as he turned to look over his shoulder, the shadows of the trees casting a terrifying form in the distance. They were closer now. They were almost upon them. He pushed the boy forward, urging him faster. The boy was starting to struggle, his breaths short and labored. Robert felt a surge of frustration and guilt. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to be in this position again, running from something he couldn't escape. Another sound, a faint rustling, a twig snapping. The hairs on the back of Robert's neck stood up as he realized they were surrounded. The forest wasn't just quiet. It was watching. The sense of dread that had been growing in him for hours now burst into full force. They weren't alone. "Run!" Robert barked. "Run now!" His voice cracked with urgency, the command snapping the boy into action. The boy's legs moved faster, but Robert could see the fear in his eyes. The boy knew they weren't escaping. Not like this. The forest seemed to press in from all sides as they ran. Robert's mind raced, his heart pounding against his chest. He couldn't let them get caught. He couldn't let the boy die. They had to find a way to fight back. But the forest was closing in, and the shadows were everywhere. A shout rang out behind them, followed by a gunshot. Robert flinched, ducking instinctively, his heart slamming into his ribs. The bullet whizzed past them, close enough that he could hear it slice through the air. They were too close. They had to find shelter. The boy's breathing was ragged now, his body trembling. Robert could feel the weight of the boy's fear, the terror that had taken root deep inside him. It mirrored his own, but there was no time to comfort him. There was only time to survive. They reached a small outcrop, a rocky area that jutted out from the trees. Robert pulled the boy behind it, both of them crouching low. They were hidden for now, but not for long. Robert could hear them moving, their pursuit relentless. The hunt had only just begun. The night crept in quickly, the silence of the forest settling over them like a blanket. Robert's mind raced, his fingers twitching against the cool steel of the rifle. It felt like a lifetime since he'd last held it. But now, it was all he had. He had sworn never to use it again. The weight of his family's death still haunted him, the echoes of battle still fresh in his memory. But here, with the boy in danger, there was no choice. He had to fight, even if it meant breaking his vow. The boy shifted beside him, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with fear. Robert could see the terror in his eyes, the same terror that had once consumed him. It was a look he knew all too well. They were in this together now. "Stay close," Robert murmured, his voice low. The boy nodded, his eyes never leaving the shadows around them. They could hear the faint crackling of leaves, the sounds of men moving through the forest, searching for them. Robert's grip tightened on the rifle. They weren't ready for a fight, but they didn't have much of a choice. The sounds were getting closer, the men's movements more deliberate. Robert couldn't risk being caught unprepared. He glanced around, searching for an escape route, but the forest was thick with shadows. They were trapped for now. The rifle in Robert's hands felt cold, its weight heavy with the ghosts of his past. He hadn't wanted to return to this life. He had tried to leave it behind. But the boy had changed everything. He couldn't just sit by and watch him die. "Do you know how to use this?" Robert asked softly, his gaze meeting the boy's. The boy swallowed hard, his face pale in the moonlight. "No," he replied, his voice barely audible. Robert nodded, his fingers brushing over the rifle's stock, the familiarity of it almost comforting. He knew what was coming. They wouldn't be able to outrun them. Not now. Robert had been in too many situations like this. He could hear the men moving through the trees, their voices hushed but urgent. They were getting closer, too close. The boy flinched as another twig snapped nearby. Robert's grip tightened on the rifle. The moment was coming. He could feel it in his bones. It was only a matter of time before the men found them. And when they did, Robert had to make sure they didn't make it out alive. "You stay down," Robert ordered, his voice low and steady. The boy nodded, crouching down behind the rocks as Robert moved into position. He had to wait for the right moment. He couldn't afford to miss. The shadows in the trees were his only cover. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Robert's eyes never left the shadows. His senses stretched thin. The wind rustled through the trees, but it wasn't enough to mask the sound of footsteps closing in. His heart was racing, but he couldn't afford to make a sound. The men were almost there. Robert's muscles tensed, every nerve screaming at him to act. He had trained for this. He had survived for years by trusting his instincts, by being ready. But this wasn't just another hunt. This was different. This was personal. The first figure appeared through the trees, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Robert's breath caught in his throat. He was close, too close, but he couldn't fire yet. He needed more. He needed them to get closer before he took his shot. Another figure emerged, and then another. Robert counted 3 men in total, moving cautiously through the underbrush. He had the advantage. He had the element of surprise, but he couldn't waste it. The boy's life was on the line, and Robert wouldn't fail him. Finally, they were close enough. Robert exhaled slowly, his finger resting gently on the trigger. He knew what he had to do. This was his chance. He raised the rifle, his aim steady, his focus clear. There was no room for error, not this time. He squeezed the trigger, the sharp crack of the rifle breaking the night's silence. The first man fell, the second one stumbling as the shot rang out. The third man hesitated, looking for the source of the shot, but Robert was already moving, his next shot aimed and ready. The second shot rang out, and the second man dropped, his body crumpling to the ground with a sickening thud. Robert didn't pause. His eyes locked onto the third man, who was already reaching for his own weapon. But Robert was faster. Another shot. Another life taken. The forest was silent again, the only sound the ringing in Robert's ears. His heart was pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The boy was safe, for now. But Robert knew this was only the beginning. They had made their stand, but the war was far from over. The forest was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the gunfire. Robert's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding as he surveyed the fallen men. He didn't feel relief, only a deep sense of dread. This wasn't over. They had only bought themselves a little time. The boy was still crouched behind the rocks, eyes wide, his body trembling. Robert's gaze softened as he moved toward him, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the boy was witnessing this horror for the first time. This wasn't the world he should know. "We're not safe yet," Robert muttered, his voice low and steady. He moved back into the shadows, scanning the forest. The men might be dead, but there were others. He could feel it in his bones. The hunt would continue, and they wouldn't stop until they had the boy. The boy rose slowly, his body stiff, as if he were afraid to move. Robert placed a hand on his shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. "We need to keep moving," he said. The boy didn't speak, but Robert could see the fear in his eyes. They moved through the forest, staying low, making as little noise as possible. Every crack of a branch underfoot felt like a gunshot. Every rustle of leaves sent their hearts racing. It was hard to tell whether the danger was real or just in their minds, but it was there. Robert's senses were on high alert, every muscle tensed, his hand resting on the rifle. He kept his movements slow and calculated, knowing that one wrong move could give away their position. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming. They came to a small clearing, and Robert paused, taking in their surroundings. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. It was quiet here, too quiet. Something felt wrong, and Robert couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Stay here," Robert whispered, his voice barely audible. He moved to the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the trees. He didn't know why, but something told him they were being followed. The shadows seemed to shift around him, too fluid, too deliberate. The boy nodded, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the tree line. Robert could see the fear in him, the terror of not knowing what was coming. It was the same fear Robert had felt all those years ago, the fear of being hunted, of being nothing more than prey. Robert's heart pounded as he slowly crouched behind a thick cluster of bushes, his eyes locked on the forest beyond. His rifle was ready, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The slightest movement, the smallest sound, and he would fire. He couldn't afford to miss. Time seemed to stretch as he waited, every minute feeling like an eternity. His muscles ached from the tension, his mind racing with thoughts of what might be lurking in the darkness, but he didn't move, not yet. He had to be patient. They weren't safe until they were far from here. The night seemed to grow colder, the wind picking up and rustling the trees. Robert shivered despite himself, his eyes narrowing as he caught a movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure, moving swiftly and silently through the trees. Robert's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't see the man clearly, but Robert knew it wasn't one of the men he had just killed. This was someone new, someone who had been tracking them all along. Robert's instincts screamed at him to act, but he held steady, waiting for the right moment to strike. The figure stopped just outside the clearing, his silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. Robert's grip tightened on the rifle. He wasn't sure if the man knew they were here, but Robert wasn't about to take any chances. The figure was too close, and they couldn't afford to be discovered now. Robert shifted his weight, preparing to move, but then he heard something that made his blood run cold. A sharp whistle, faint but unmistakable. It was a signal. The man wasn't alone. They were surrounded. Robert's heart raced as he stood up, ready to move, ready to fight. The boy heard it too. He looked at Robert, his eyes wide with panic. Robert quickly put a finger to his lips, signaling for him to stay quiet. The boy nodded, his body trembling as he crouched low to the ground. There was no time to explain. They had to act fast. Robert stepped back into the shadows, crouching low behind the trees, his rifle raised and ready. His thoughts were clear now. They had no choice but to fight. Running was no longer an option. The boy's life was in his hands, and Robert wasn't about to let them take him. As the figures began to emerge from the forest, Robert's mind focused. He had been in situations like this before. He knew how to fight, how to survive. But this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting the boy, no matter what. The first man stepped into the clearing, his rifle raised, eyes scanning the area. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moving with the confidence of someone who knew the land. But Robert was faster. With one fluid motion, he took aim and fired. The man dropped to the ground with a muffled thud. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the forest, and for a moment, everything went still. Robert's heart raced as he scanned the trees, waiting for any sign of movement. He knew the others wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. This fight was far from over. The boy was still crouched behind the rocks, his body trembling. Robert could see the fear in his eyes, but there was something else, too. Determination. He wasn't just running from his past anymore. He was fighting for his future, for a chance to survive. "We need to move," Robert said, his voice low. The boy nodded, his face pale but resolute. Robert extended a hand, pulling him to his feet. They couldn't stay here. The sound of the shot would draw others, and they would be waiting for them. Robert led the boy through the trees, moving quickly but carefully. The terrain was rugged, the underbrush thick with roots and brambles. Every step felt like a risk, but they had no choice. They had to find shelter before the others could catch up to them. The boy's breath came in short bursts, his feet stumbling as he followed Robert. He was weak, exhausted, but Robert didn't have time to offer comfort. The forest was closing in on them. They had to reach the hidden shelter before it was too late. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they moved deeper into the woods. Robert glanced over his shoulder, scanning for any signs of pursuit. The trees were dense, and the shadows grew longer with each passing second. He hoped they were far enough ahead. They came to a small ravine, the steep walls lined with thick undergrowth. Robert paused, surveying the area. There, nestled in the shadows, was an old, abandoned shack. One Robert had used in the past. It wasn't much, but it was the best they had. "Stay close," Robert instructed, guiding the boy toward the shack. The structure was small, nearly camouflaged by the trees, but it offered shelter. He didn't want to risk leading them any deeper into the woods. They needed to regroup, plan, and rest. The boy seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. He didn't question Robert's orders. His eyes, wide with fear, darted around the clearing, scanning for any sign of movement. Robert kept his hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding him forward. This was their safest option for now. Inside, the shack was musty, the air thick with dust. Robert quickly moved to the far corner, pushing aside a stack of old crates. He cleared a small space on the floor, gesturing for the boy to sit. There wasn't much time to rest, but they needed a moment of respite. The boy collapsed onto the floor, his exhaustion clear in every line of his face. Robert crouched beside him, scanning the surroundings. The shack was decaying, but it was hidden well enough. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would have to do for now. Robert moved to the window, peering through a crack in the boards. He couldn't see much beyond the trees, but he knew they were being hunted. The sound of movement outside was faint but persistent, like the steps of something, or someone, following their trail. The boy curled up on the floor, his body shaking with fear. Robert watched him for a moment, torn between the need to comfort him and the urgency of the situation. He had never been good at offering solace, but the boy needed to know he wasn't alone. "Hey," Robert said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "We'll make it through this. You just have to trust me." The boy didn't respond, but Robert could see the way his body relaxed just slightly. He wasn't alone. Not yet. And Robert wasn't going to let him be. The forest outside remained still. Too still. Robert's mind raced as he replayed the events leading up to this moment. The boys passed. The message burned into the door, the men chasing them. It all pointed to something bigger. Something Robert didn't fully understand. He couldn't shake the feeling that the boy's past was tied to something far darker than he realized. Whoever had marked him, whoever had hunted him, was part of a much larger, more dangerous world. Robert was knee-deep in that world now, and there was no going back. Robert exhaled slowly, his thoughts drifting back to his own past. The war, the family he had lost, the life he had once known. He had left it all behind, but the ghosts never stopped chasing him. And now, the boy was caught in that same storm. The shack creaked as the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards. Robert stood, his mind racing. He needed to make a plan. They couldn't stay here forever, but they needed more than just a plan. They needed to know who was hunting them and why. The boy stirred, his eyes opening slowly. He looked at Robert, fear still etched across his face. "Why are they after me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Robert met his gaze, the weight of the question heavy in the air. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. "We'll figure it out," Robert said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. "But we have to stay alive first." The boy nodded, his eyes clouded with confusion. Robert could see the pain in them, the pain of someone who had lost everything and had nowhere left to turn. Robert moved toward the door, checking the old lock to make sure it was secure. The night was closing in, the forest outside dark and silent. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. They couldn't stay here forever. The hunt was still on. The night stretched on, heavy with silence, the air thick with anticipation. Robert kept his eyes on the forest, his hand resting on the rifle, waiting. Every noise felt amplified, every shadow an impending threat. It was only a matter of time before they came. The boy, still huddled on the floor, didn't speak. His eyes were fixed on the corner of the shack, but Robert could see the fear in him, the fear of what was to come. They both knew the danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shack's old walls. Robert could feel the pressure building, the weight of what was happening closing in. He had spent his life avoiding confrontation, running from the past. But now, it was inevitable. There would be no running this time. His mind wandered briefly to his family, the wife and daughter he had lost to violence. He had tried to forget, to bury that pain. But now, it resurfaced, twisting his heart with regret. The boy's life mirrored his own loss. He couldn't let it end the same way. A faint sound reached Robert's ears. A twig snapping, a soft crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. He turned sharply, his hand tightening around the rifle. They were getting closer. He could feel it. The air seemed to thicken with the presence of danger. The hunters were near. The boy stirred, his eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Robert's gaze flicked to him, then back to the window. "Stay low. Stay quiet," he ordered, his voice calm despite the rising tension. "We fight if we have to, but we survive." The boy nodded, but his body was stiff with fear. Robert could see the weight of the situation pressing on him. He was just a child, thrown into a world of violence. Robert's heart twisted at the thought of what this would do to him. What it had already done. Outside, the sounds grew clearer, shuffling footsteps, soft whispers, the rustling of leaves. The hunters were closing in, their movements deliberate and calculated. They knew exactly where Robert and the boy were, and they were not going to let them escape. Robert moved to the corner of the shack, crouching low. He checked his rifle, ensuring it was ready. He had done this before, fought to survive, fought to protect. But something was different now. The stakes were higher. The boy was counting on him. He couldn't fail. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of smoke and earth. Robert's eyes narrowed as he listened, his senses on high alert. There was no mistaking it. They were almost here. The time for planning was over. It was time to face what was coming, time to make his stand. The boy's voice broke the silence, soft and shaky. "Do you think they'll come for me?" Robert turned to him, his face hard. "They will," he said, his voice low, "but they'll have to get through me first." The boy looked at him, unsure whether to believe him. Robert's mind raced as he thought about the men outside. Who were they? Why were they after the boy? And who had sent them? He didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. He couldn't let them take him, not without a fight, not without paying for it. The shack creaked again, the wind pushing against the walls. Robert stood, his muscles tense, ready for the confrontation. He had made his choice. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, he would face it head on, with the boy at his side. Footsteps. Closer now. Robert could hear them, the sound of boots crunching on the forest floor. The men were just outside. He gripped the rifle tighter, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He could take them one by one, but only if they gave him the chance. The first figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by the pale moonlight. Robert's heart stopped for a split second, but he didn't hesitate. He raised the rifle and aimed, his breath steady. The shot rang out, the man falling to the ground with a sharp, sickening thud. The boy gasped, his eyes wide with fear. "Is he dead?" he whispered. Robert nodded, his focus never leaving the doorway. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice cold. The boy didn't argue. Robert had done this before, but tonight, he wasn't fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for the boy's. The second figure appeared, his rifle raised. He didn't hesitate, taking aim at Robert. But Robert was faster. Another shot rang out, another man falling. The boy flinched at the sound, but Robert kept his eyes on the remaining men, his mind racing with the thought of what they would do next. The last two men were now fully visible, their weapons drawn. They had seen their comrades fall, and the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They hesitated, unsure whether to advance or retreat. Robert didn't wait for them to decide. He fired again, taking out the third man with a clean shot. The final man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure, stood frozen for a moment, his eyes locked on Robert. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Robert knew this man would either surrender or fight to the death, and he wasn't planning to let him escape alive. The man lunged forward, raising his weapon. But Robert was quicker. A final shot rang out, the man crumpling to the ground. Silence fell once again. The only sound, the crackling of the fire outside and the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. Robert lowered the rifle, his breathing ragged. The fight was over, for now. The boy slowly stood up, his eyes wide with disbelief. You killed them?" he whispered. Robert nodded, his heart heavy. "I had to," he said quietly. "I wasn't going to let them take you."